October 3, 1913. A Friday. President Woodrow Wilson sits in the Oval Office, dipping his pen into ink to sign the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act. Buried within this massive trade document is Section 2. It is exactly 15 pages long. It contains a very specific, carefully calculated mathematical formula. A 1% tax on net personal incomes above $3,000, with a surtax topping out at 7% for the absolute wealthiest citizens in the country. The politicians selling this new law to the American public make a concrete, unbreakable promise. They swear this new federal income tax will only ever target the top 1% of earners, the titans of industry, the railroad barons, the oil tycoons. If you are an ordinary mechanic, a farmer, a factory worker, or a teacher, you will never pay a single cent. The government will not touch your paycheck. It is a class tax, designed purely to make the ultra-rich pay their fair share. That was the guarantee. Look at your pay stub today. Look at the money vanished from your gross earnings before the check ever hits your bank account. Today, the federal tax code stretches past 74,000 pages. The vast majority of working Americans pay it. The top rate has not stayed at 7%. Over the decades, it has climbed as high as 94%. Every single promise made in that room in 1913 was broken. This is the true origin of income tax, what they promised in 1913 and what actually happened. It is not just a story about accounting or government revenue. It is a story about the mechanics of power. It is about how a state redefines a temporary crisis as a permanent normal, taking control of the money supply one emergency at a time. The real history of the American income tax does not actually start with Woodrow Wilson. It starts 50 years earlier, in a room smelling of stale cigar smoke and panic. It is July 1861. The Civil War is bleeding the Union dry. The federal government is spending roughly $2 million a day to keep the Army fed and armed. The Treasury is practically empty. President Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet need cash, and they need it immediately. Tariffs and excise taxes on liquor and tobacco are not covering the staggering cost of kinetic action against the Confederacy. So, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase proposes something radical: a direct tax on the incomes of citizens. Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1861, imposing a flat 3% tax on annual incomes over $800. Next year, they replace it with a graduated system through the Revenue Act of 1862. This is the first federal income tax in American history. It is sold strictly as a wartime emergency measure, a temporary sacrifice to save the nation. Citizens comply because the terminal outcome of losing the war is unthinkable. To enforce this new extraction, the government creates the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the direct ancestor of today's IRS, and appoints George Boutwell as the first commissioner. He hires tax assessors to knock on doors and inspect financial records. The Union wins, the emergency ends, but the mechanism is already built. Politicians now know that citizens will surrender a portion of their income if the crisis is severe enough. The government keeps the tax going for 7 years after the surrender at Appomattox, quietly collecting revenue until public anger grows too loud. In 1872, the Civil War income tax is repealed. The beast goes dormant, but it does not die. By the 1890s, the American economy is fundamentally transforming. The Gilded Age concentrates massive wealth into the hands of a few industrial monopolies. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller amass unprecedented fortunes, largely untouched by federal taxes. Meanwhile, farmers and laborers are struggling under the weight of high consumer tariffs, which is how the federal government primarily funds itself. Tariffs act like a regressive tax, punishing the poor who buy imported goods, clothing, and tools, while shielding the untaxed fortunes of the rich. Populist politicians, led by fiery orators like William Jennings Bryan, demand a return to the income tax to balance the scales. In 1894, they succeed, attaching a 2% tax on incomes over $4,000 to the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. The wealthy elite do not just accept this. They fight back with devastating legal force. Charles Pollock, a shareholder in the Farmers Loan and Trust Company of New York, sues his own firm to prevent them from paying the new tax. He hires superstar lawyer Joseph Choate, who argues that the tax is communistic in nature and a direct assault on private property. Pollock claims the federal government has no constitutional right to levy a direct tax on personal income without apportioning it among the states by population. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court in 1895. In a dramatic 5-4 decision, Chief Justice Melville Fuller delivers the killing blow. He declares the income tax unconstitutional. Justice Stephen Field writes a concurring opinion that serves as a chilling prophecy, warning that a small tax today will inevitably become a large, oppressive tax tomorrow. The conservative establishment celebrates. The New York Sun calls the ruling a victory over the socialist march. The constitutional door to an income tax is slammed, shut, locked, and barricaded by the highest court in the land. To fix it, the populists would have to do the impossible. They would have to amend the Constitution of the United States. Fast forward to 1909. The wealth gap has only widened. The progressive movement is tearing through American politics, demanding an end to crony capitalism. The pressure for an income tax is reaching a boiling point. President William Howard Taft tries to thread the needle by proposing a corporate excise tax alongside a constitutional amendment for a personal income tax. Conservative Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich, a wealthy ally of J.P. Morgan, decides to play a high-stakes game of political chess. Aldrich absolutely hates the idea of an income tax, but he wants to kill a different tariff reform bill that is gaining momentum. So, he supports passing the constitutional amendment out of Congress and sending it to the states. Aldrich is bluffing. He is entirely convinced that conservative state legislatures will never, ever ratify it. It is a fake concession meant to buy time and quiet the radical wing of his party. He calculates that the states will vote it down, the issue will die, and his wealthy friends will remain completely untouched. It is one of the most disastrous political miscalculations in American history. The bluff fails completely. To Aldrich's horror, state after state votes to ratify the 16th Amendment. It sweeps through the South and the West, regions desperate to shift the tax burden onto Eastern bankers. On February 3, 1913, Delaware becomes the 36th state to ratify. The 16th Amendment becomes the law of the land. It states plainly that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states. The constitutional barrier is completely destroyed, which brings us back to October 1913, the Oval Office, and that 15-page document. Representative Cordell Hull of Tennessee drafts the new tax law. He knows the American public is deeply suspicious of this massive new federal power. To get it passed, Hull and his allies must convince the working class that this gun will never be pointed at them. They set the exemption threshold at $3,000 for a single person, which is roughly $85,000 in today's money. At the time, the average American worker makes only about $800 a year. The math is clear. Less than 1% of the population qualifies. It is exclusively a tax on the rich. In 1913, only 358,000 people file a return out of a population of nearly 100 million. The trap is perfectly disguised. The public accepts it. But the fundamental flaw in the 1913 promise is that it relies entirely on the restraint of future politicians. There is no constitutional limit on how high the rate can go, or how low the exemption can drop. The government has built a massive engine of revenue extraction. They just promise to keep the engine running in first gear. Then, the crisis arrives. In April 1917, the United States enters the First World War. The federal budget skyrockets from $700 million to $12 billion almost overnight. The government needs an oceanic amount of money to send 2 million men to the trenches of Europe. The 1913 promise is immediately thrown out the window. Congress passes the War Revenue Act of 1917. They slash the personal exemption down to $1,000, dragging thousands of middle-class workers into the tax pool for the very first time. They crank the top tax rate from 7% to 67%. The next year, in the Revenue Act of 1918, the top rate hits an astonishing 77%. The government justifies this by pointing to the terminal outcome of losing the war. The government also uses the Espionage Act to suppress dissent, making it incredibly dangerous to criticize the state's financial demands. It is an emergency. Patriotism demands your money. But observe the permanent shift in how the state funds itself. The United States completely moves away from tariffs and relies primarily on extracting wealth directly from its citizens, giving it the financial firepower to become a global superpower. Even after the war ends and the emergency fades, the tax does not go away. During the 1920s, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon manages to cut the top rate back down to 25%, but the infrastructure of the income tax remains fully operational. The government has grown accustomed to the revenue. The monster is simply resting. It wakes up completely during the darkest days of the 20th century. December 1941. Pearl Harbor is attacked. The United States is pulled into the Second World War. The financial requirements of this war make 1917 look like a minor accounting error. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. face an impossible math problem. They have to fund a global two-front war against industrial superpowers. Taxing the top 1% is no longer mathematically sufficient to build the thousands of tanks, ships, and bombers required. The money must come from the working class. The Revenue Act of 1942 fundamentally rewrites the American social contract. Roosevelt drops the exemption level down to just $500. The base tax rate spikes to 19%. Suddenly, almost every working American is legally required to pay income tax. The tax rolls explode from roughly 4 million filers in 1939 to 43 million by 1945. Employers suddenly find themselves acting as administrative arms of the IRS. To convince the public to accept this crushing new reality, the Treasury Department launches the greatest financial propaganda campaign in American history. They hire Walt Disney. They produce a cartoon called The New Spirit, featuring Donald Duck eagerly paying his income tax to defeat the Axis powers. Donald literally writes a check to the government to help make bullets, to build ships, to build planes. The message is relentless. Paying taxes is your duty. Evading them makes you an enemy of the state. The campaign works. The American public accepts the mass income tax as a necessary sacrifice to achieve victory. But there is a massive logistical problem. Up until this point, Americans paid their income tax in one single lump sum on March 15 of the following year. If you owed taxes for 1941, you wrote a massive check in March 1942. As long as only wealthy people paid, this system worked flawlessly. Millionaires had the liquidity to write big checks. But now, millions of factory workers, secretaries, and mechanics owe hundreds of dollars. Ordinary workers do not save a portion of their weekly paycheck for a massive tax bill a year later. They spend it to survive. By early 1943, the Treasury realizes that millions of Americans are going to default on their taxes simply because they do not have the cash on hand on tax day. The system is on the verge of total collapse. Enter Beardsley Rummel. Rummel's the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the treasurer of Macy's department store. With his background at the University of Chicago, he understands consumer psychology better than any politician in Washington. Rummel observes that customers at Macy's struggle to pay off large lump sum debts, but they easily manage small installment payments over time. He brings this retail logic to the federal government. He proposes a brilliant, highly manipulative solution. Do not wait for the citizen to pay the tax. Take the money before the citizen ever receives it. Force the employer to act as the primary tax collector. Deduct the tax directly from the weekly paycheck. This is the birth of the withholding system. The Treasury initially rejects his plan because Rummel insists they must forgive a portion of the massive 1942 tax bill to transition everyone to the new system. But the public demands a solution to their unpayable tax debts, forcing Congress to act. The current Tax Payment Act of 1943 turns Rummel's idea into law. It is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. By taking the money at the source, the government makes the mass income tax practically invisible. The worker stops thinking about their gross pay and only focuses on their take-home pay. Because they never hold the cash in their hands, they do not feel the physical pain of giving it away. Even better, the government intentionally overcollects throughout the year, allowing them to issue a tax refund in the spring. Citizens are mathematically tricked into feeling happy when the government returns a fraction of the money it took from them, interest-free. Withholding completely neutralizes public resistance. It transforms a highly visible, deeply unpopular annual lump sum payment into a silent, steady, automatic extraction of wealth. The mass income tax is now permanently locked into the American economic system. The Second World War ends in 1945. The emergency is over. The fascist empires are destroyed. But the mass income tax is never repealed. The temporary emergency measure is declared the permanent normal. The rates fluctuate over the next 80 years, but the fundamental mechanism remains completely intact. The government discovers that once a mass tax is successfully implemented during a crisis, citizens will simply adjust their baseline expectations and accept it as a permanent fact of life. This is how power actually expands. It does not happen overnight in a grand, tyrannical sweep. It happens through slow, methodical, incremental shifts, always justified by an immediate emergency, always promising that it will only target somebody else. The men who sat in that room in 1913, swearing that the income tax would never touch the ordinary American, were either incredibly naive or intentionally deceptive. They built an architecture of extraction that was perfectly designed to expand whenever the state needed more fuel. They laid the tracks for a train that would eventually run over the entire population. Today, the system consumes trillions of dollars, funding an apparatus of global influence and massive domestic bureaucracy that the politicians of 1913 could not possibly comprehend. You pay for it every single week, before you even buy your groceries, before you pay your mortgage, before you see your own money. The origin of the income tax is the ultimate case study in the danger of temporary government powers. Once the door is opened, it is never closed again. If you found this historical investigation valuable, if you want to understand the hidden mechanics behind the systems that govern our daily lives, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. What other temporary emergency powers do you think the government has made permanent? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next